Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Ross Clark. Ross, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So, Ross, I want to talk to you about net zero and climate change, the environmental movement, all those interesting, fascinating topics, hooked off your brilliant new book, Not Zero, How an Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Won't Even Save the Planet. I always love it when a book title says everything and then you have to dig in to get all the details. So I guess the best way for us to kick off in a discussion about net zero and what it really means is to say what net zero is. So can you just kick us off by saying what you understand the net zero policy to be? What does it force us to do, or what does it suggest we need to do in order to save ourselves from climate change?
Well, what the government has done is put itself under, it's not just a target, it is a legal commitment. So to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And what that means, it's not just carbon emissions, it's greenhouse gas emissions, which are slightly different, includes things like methane. And what the sort of net bit means is that, if we are still emitting some form of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases by 2050, we have to make up for that through what are called negative emissions, removing carbon from the air, which is, a technology which is possible, but it's extremely expensive and, it's not fully developed. The more you look into it, the more you realize how sort of fantastically expensive this could be. And it requires multiple technological breakthroughs in all sorts of areas. It's not just energy. People get sort of, obsessed with energy on this, but things like steel, cement industries, making chemicals, making fertilizers, plastics industries, all those things have what they call process emissions, whereby it's not just the energy consumed, but actually the chemical process releases large amounts of carbon dioxide. And it is incredibly difficult to come up with solutions to remove that. There are potential technology, but they're all like 3 or 4 times more expensive than what we use already. And the other point to make is that when the government says net zero, it's referring only to what are called territorial carbon emissions. Those are carbon emissions physically spewed out within Britain. It excludes aviation, it excludes shipping, but more importantly, it excludes carbon emissions emitted elsewhere in the world in the name of manufacturing goods and producing food for British consumers. And what that means is it gives the government this sort of perverse incentive to export our manufacturing industry, or what remains of our manufacturing industry, our food production, and so on, just to reach this arbitrary target. Because, if you move your steel industry to India, say, then, it counts towards India's territorial emissions. It's subtracted from Britain's territorial emissions. So, we're already seeing. I mean, you look at BASF, the German industrial giant, a few weeks ago announced that it was going to not invest anymore in Europe because of net zero and the high energy costs, and it's building a £10 billion factory in China instead. That's a European jobs, European wealth just directly exported to China as a result of net zero commitments.
Yeah, I want to get into that a bit later on. The question of Western countries increasingly outsourcing the dirty work, as some would see it, to countries like China, countries like India, and what that represents. But just to stick with the net zero idea to begin with, it's one of those strange ideologies that has just become a buzzword. It's just seen as an instantly positive buzz phrase, net zero. It's supposed to give you a warm feeling, and we're all supposed to be committed to it. I think people would be pretty shocked to hear someone like you or anyone else say, listen, this might not be such a good idea. It's one of those phrases that just rolls off the political tongue as something that it is admirable for a government to commit itself to. But in your book and in your writings around this issue, you raise numerous important questions. Firstly, as you've just said there, it will be an incredibly expensive endeavor. It will hamper Britain's ability to produce things domestically, to create those kinds of jobs, to do things within its own territory as it sees fit. And it also, this is one thing I think is quite striking, it also allows other people to hold the government hostage. So now that we've made it a legal stipulation that Britain will achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, it's a legal demand on our government makes of itself. That means that groups can sue the government if they think it's going off track, if it's not going to reach the target that it had promised it would reach. So my question for you is, why would a government do this to itself? So in the British context, the situation is largely that the government committed itself to decarbonising the economy a fairly long time ago. But what Theresa May did during her short-lived, pretty disastrous premiership, she attached the legal stipulation that we would achieve net zero by 2050. And it gives rise to all these problems. Lots of spending, lots of confusion as to how this will be achieved, and an inability of the government to do what it might need to do in its own country. Why would a government do something like that to itself and hamper itself in that way?
Well, it is very puzzling. And as you say, I mean, not only can environmental groups sue the government over this, they already are. There's already numerous cases going through the courts where environmental groups are taking government to court saying this development or that development, this policy or that policy is not consistent with your net zero commitment by 2050, and it is therefore illegal. And they've started to win as well. Over the third runway at Heathrow, it was later overturned by the Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeal ruled that there should be no third runway at Heathrow because it was inconsistent with the 2050 target. And again, last July, a group, one of these crowd-funded legal groups, won an action saying that the government's net zero strategy was not good enough. It was not consistent with its obligations, the obligations it put on itself, and the government, as a result, is having to rewrite its strategy. And as closer we get to that target, the more often these groups will win, because if you've said you're going to eliminate all carbon emissions by 2050, well, then how could an international airport possibly be consistent with those aims? And it was, on the government as well, it's also rebounding on private companies. Shell lost an action in the Netherlands in 2021. The Netherlands court ruled that, the company had not got a strategy for meeting the Netherlands net zero targets. And, again, activists are going to go for private companies more and more, and they're going to push them abroad. If you're an oil or gas company, why stay in Britain and put up with this? I mean, the first reaction of Shell, by the way, which, used to have a dual listing in UK and the Netherlands, was to end its Netherlands listing, become a UK-only company. And we get more and more oil and gas companies. They're just selling off a lot of their oil and gas interests because it's just too much of a liability because they get sued, and those parts of the industries are sort of going abroad. And Shell at the same time, they're providing my broadband for me. I mean, they just sort of had to diversify into other industries so they can sort of hit the targets that are put upon them.
Yeah, and it's remarkable how it's almost everything that the government says it needs to do now in terms of, for example, the Whitehaven coal station that is being planned. Instantly, that was called into question on the basis of the net zero commitments. And you can see a situation where everything the government commits itself to do in terms of building something new, especially something new which includes emissions, whether in the building of it or in the production of it over subsequent decades, everything is just instantly called into question by campaigners. And the government has clearly made a huge rod for its own back by committing the country to net zero emissions by 2050. I wanted to ask you specifically about the expense of it and how much this will cost, because some of the stuff you've written in relation to the cost is really quite shocking. So there was an estimation from the Climate Change Committee, which advises the government on what it needs to do to address the climate change problem. There was advice from them that it would net zero would cost around 50 billion a year between 2030 and 2050. And you've pointed out that, just to put that into perspective, when the government denied nurses a 3% pay rise a year or so ago, that saved the government £300 million. And that is what net zero would cost in 2 days if this piece of advice is accurate, that it will be 50 billion a year. So it's an incredible expense, isn't it, in terms of how much it will cost? Could you just outline what those costs entail and whether you think people understand just how expensive the net zero project is going to be?
Yeah, well, first I think it's important to point out that was an estimate by the government's Climate Change Committee, £1 trillion between now and 2050. National Grid looked into it just at the cost of decarbonising the grid and came up with a figure of £3 trillion investment. Then the Treasury was pressed, to come up with its own estimation. It said it couldn't. There's just too many unknowns. Nobody knows how much it would cost to reach net zero, nor how we could do it. Because, as I was saying, that there are so many different areas that involve carbon emissions that the technologies don't exist. And, the Climate Change Committee knew this. At the same time, they came up with this figure in 2019. And MPs just sort of swallowed it whole, thought, that doesn't sound too much, and just sort of nodded the whole thing through without realising there's a complete bogus figure. But just to give a few examples of where the costs will fall upon ordinary people, part of the Climate Change Committee has advised is that all homes should have a energy performance certificate rating of C or above by 2035. And Chris Skidmore's latest report says that should be brought forward to 2033. If you're, say, on the bottom rung of the housing ladder, you own a Victorian 2 up, 2 down in Manchester or something and worth £50,000, the house might be worth £50,000. It could cost another £30,000 to get that up to a good energy rating, because if you've got old home with solid walls and gas boiler and this sort of thing, it's known that to insulate solid walls, the government's own energy quango says £10,000 upwards. The heat pump, that's another £10,000. And, those are costs which will fall upon ordinary people. If they don't pay them, they won't be able to sell their house. So, they'll be trapped. You can't sell your house. You can't afford the improvements. Again, a look at electric cars. People go saying electric cars are cheaper to run than petrol or diesel cars. Well, no, they're not, because they cost half as much again to buy as the petrol or diesel equivalent. And although the running costs to the consumer at the moment might be fairly similar, the per mile cost of electricity and the per mile cost of petrol, but that ignores something very important, that 60% of what you pay for a litre of petrol is tax, whereas you charge your car up at home, you're only paying 5% VAT on the electricity. And there's no way that the government is going to let £28 billion of road and fuel duty just go out the window when we transfer to electric cars. So that's an extra cost that's coming. The government will have to switch to some kind of road pricing just to preserve its road income, and so eventually the cost of running an electric car will be far more than a petrol or diesel one. It becomes hard to imagine. We just cannot switch to electric cars without pushing a lot of people off the road, basically.
You raised the issue of electricity there. I really agree with you on electric cars. And there's such a kind of Panglossian view of electric cars coming in. The environment will be saved. It will be cheaper for people, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't stack up when you look into it in a bit more detail, which you have done. But you raised the issue of electricity. We will need a lot of electricity, not only for all these electric cars we're supposedly going to have, but for society in general. And if there were to be this march towards net zero, this restriction on what can be produced and done territorially within the United Kingdom itself, this push for greater use of renewables, this problematization of nuclear power, which we're seeing all the time. Coal-fired stations, of course, are seen as a big no-no, although we might get one soon. Given all that, where is the electricity going to come from? How is this stuff going to be made and maintained if, alongside seeing the use of electric cars and other electric products as the solution, we're also continually downsizing the nation's ability to produce the energy one might need for electricity and other things?
What we're doing at the moment, I mean, Britain's actually been very successful at switching away from coal, which has reduced carbon emissions by a very significant amount. Put it very broadly, a decade ago, we were using 40% gas, 40% coal, and 20% nuclear and a few other things. Now we're using 40% gas, 40% renewables, solar and wind. And that sort of works reasonably well. It's not we use wind and solar when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and then when it's not, we switch on the gas. That's not the most efficient way of using gas, by the way, but it does keep the lights on. But from 2035, the government has said, we're going to do away with gas. We're going to do away with all fossil fuel from the national grid, and it's going to be all zero carbon energy. And nobody has explained to me what we are going to do then when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining. Like last month in December, we had a cold December, very still, calm weather. And of course, in December, you're generating very, very little solar energy. What happens in future? And the government's only strategy seems to be more solar, more wind, more solar, more wind. And, companies there's a lot of investment in wind and solar because it makes a lot of sense for a pension fund or something which wants very reliable income, because if you invest in wind and solar, the government will offer you a fixed contract, fixed prices for next 15 years, very reliable, very safe form of income. And at the same time, the government's trying to solve this problem of intermittency by what it calls a capacity market, where it says we'll also auction, we'll have auctions of people who can provide electricity at short notice. And the idea was that this was going to generate all kinds of bright ideas of hydrogen and battery storage and so on. And we've had a few battery installations, but, capital just does not want to invest in energy storage at the moment. All these capacity auctions keep being won by the gas companies because it's just so much cheaper to do that in spite of elevated gas prices. And I'm looking through some figures today. The cost of storing energy via hydrogen, the cost of generating electricity from wind and solar, around about sort of $50 a megawatt hour. To store that energy, if you need then to store it, if you do it by hydrogen, that will come out at about $200 per megawatt hour. And if you do it by battery, it'll be over $300 per megawatt hour. So you're thinking to store energy at the moment under current technology costs about between 4 and 6 times as much as it costs to generate the electricity in the first place.
Mm.
And you think, well, look at the sums there. Well, every time the sun goes in and the wind stops blowing, consumers are going to be facing eye-watering electricity bills. And of course, there's a reason why the government's been so keen to get us smart meters is so that they can vary the price throughout the day, and we'll end up what's Uber-style surge pricing. The sun goes in, suddenly you're paying 4 or 5 times as much for your electricity, and but also as you were pointing out, the total generation capacity of Britain is not going up.
Mm.
We're going to have electric cars. We've been told our heating's going to have to be electric, and yet there's actually a downward trend in the overall amount of generation capacity because we closed all the coal and we haven't sort of quite replaced it with wind and solar. And on some days we're importing 15, 20% of our energy, which, we never have done in the past. So, that's another sort of source of, adding to the cost and against the balance of payments of Britain is going to be our reliance on overseas energy if we persist with this sort of, rather renewables-heavy national grid.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. So I want to ask you precisely about that issue, which I find fascinating, which is the increasing reliance on forms of energy from overseas. And I think this is interesting from a number of perspectives. Firstly, there is this drive in Western countries to be so eco-virtuous that we don't do any of the dirty stuff ourselves, but we seem pretty happy for it to be done in other nations on our behalf, whether we're outsourcing certain forms of production to countries like India or importing coal from other countries. So the UK still imports tens of thousands of tons of coal. And in fact, in 2022, the third quarter of 2022, there was a big spike in the amount of coal we were importing in comparison with the same time period in 2021, because we need it. We need that stuff to keep the lights on. We also know, of course, about Germany's reliance on Russian gas and how that's all been brought to the political fore as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, which has raised huge questions for Germany about how it generates energy, whether it should be so reliant on foreign sources or whether it should focus on domestically generating its greater amounts of its own energy. What do you think that outsourcing or that reliance on other countries tells us? Firstly, about the net zero mission more broadly, kind of keeping our own hands clean, but not worrying too much about the hands of other nations. But also, isn't it possible there'll be a breaking point at some point, and arguably we're reaching it now, where because of events in Ukraine, where it becomes clear that relying on other countries for your energy is a quite dangerous thing geopolitically?
Well, that's the biggest lesson to have come out of the Ukrainian invasion. And yeah, I mean, this is what the Cumbrian coal mine is the crux of that issue, because the steel industry needs coal. You cannot produce steel at the moment in commercial quantities without using coal. It's a reducing agent to remove the oxygen from the iron oxide, basically. to leave the pure iron. Now the question comes down to, well, do you want to use British coal or do we want to import coal? Now, from the point of view of the Earth's climate, it doesn't make a lot of difference, does it? I mean, if you're burning a certain amount of coal to produce a certain amount of steel, it doesn't really matter where the coal comes from. It's slightly lower emissions, though, if you're producing the coal close to where the steel is being produced. But if we have a coal mine in Britain producing coal for British coal plants, then that's going on our territorial emissions. Yeah. If, on the other hand, we say, well, we won't open this coal mine, we'll be good to the climate goodies, we won't have any coal in Britain, and then maybe, well, the steel industry won't hang around. Maybe the steel industry will go and leave us, go to India, China, and then it's off our books. All that carbon emissions are off our books. So, purely from the British point of view, we've saved carbon emissions, we've cut carbon emissions, we can sort of, earn our global brownie points. But of course, the world is no better off. It's just we've simply transferred the emissions from one part of the world to another. And that's going to go on in many other industries. And we're talking about importing electricity. I mean, you can look on the web in an instant, find out what sort of electricity we're producing at the moment. And, governments are always sort of, renewables have reached a peak. For the first time, we're generating sort of 70% of our electricity from wind power. But then you look in greater detail and you say, well, hang on, 20% of our electricity is being imported. And you say, look, well, so much is coming from the Netherlands and Belgium. And then you look up, well, how do the Netherlands and Belgium generate their electricity? And they've still got coal plants. So, but that is not being counted on UK carbon emissions. So, it's just completely perverse. Like so many government targets, it can have these sort of completely perverse results like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary. Like, the environmental fiddling of the book seems to be taking place on a global scale at the moment, so that everyone can absolve themselves of responsibility for doing things that are apparently very bad. Okay, so this policy is, as you've outlined, is going to be very expensive, is going to hit the pockets of the ordinary British person, the ordinary British household. We're not even sure how to achieve net zero, what that will entail. And also, we're still using coal. We're still importing those things. We're still using so-called dirty fuels because you have to. There comes a point when you have to create enough energy to be able to keep the lights on in the country. So let's talk about why a country like Britain would do things like this that strike us as quite crazy and possibly quite self-destructive. So I want to dig down into the ideology of climate change, which is obviously the motor for the net zero ambitions. You talk in your book, I think you actually strike this balance very well between, on the one hand, recognizing that the planet is getting warmer, climate change is taking place, but on the other hand, calling into question, as you refer to it, the climate hyperbole that we hear all the time, not only from eco-activists, but also from government officials in the mainstream media and so on, which says that the world is really almost on fire, things are incredibly bad, an apocalypse could well be around the corner unless we drastically change our behavior to an extraordinary degree. So just talk a little bit about the tension between those two things. On the one hand, yes, climate change is occurring, but on the other hand, what climate change has come to mean in sections of the public consciousness, which is that this is almost the end of the world, that cannot be stacked up, can it, by anything that remotely resembles a scientific fact?
No, sort of paranoia feeds on itself, and sort of everybody seems to, activists will come up with a, more exaggerated thing every time. We've got this sort of habit now, which is with many reporters, with many politicians, and automatically blaming any kind of adverse weather event on man-made climate change, as if we didn't have storms, if we didn't have floods, if we never had heat waves before. climate change. Now, the sort of real side of it, to try and sort of separate out the fact from the fiction, global temperatures are rising by about sort of 0.1 Celsius a decade. That shows up in many data sets. You should accept that data. The world's getting slightly wetter, warmer air holds more moisture, overall rainfall increases. We're seeing more high temperature extremes, like last year's heat wave in Britain probably wouldn't have occurred 50 years ago. 40 degrees was unknown in Britain until last summer. But then, to balance against that, Britain's seeing fewer cold extremes. The world is seeing fewer cold extremes. And, we keep hearing figures for sort of numbers of people who were killed by last year's heat wave. You've got to balance that against the people who aren't dying because there are fewer cold extremes. There was a study by the University of Monash in Australia, which, assessed worldwide, globally, the balance of deaths from the heat and cold. And it came up with this figure that around the world, 5 million people a year die partly as a function of extreme temperatures. And I've seen this quoted by John Kerry, of all people, US climate envoy, supposedly a serious person with a lot of influence. I was at a public lecture the other week he was giving, and he said 5 million people are being killed by the heat because of choices we make. That sounds absolutely awful, doesn't it? We're warming up the planet, we're killing 5 million people a year. But that figure actually comes from the University of Monash study in Australia. And what it actually says is that 9/10 of those deaths from extreme temperatures are from extreme cold temperatures. Only 10%, fewer than 10%, are from extreme high temperatures. Mm. And furthermore, as the slight upward trend in the high temperature deaths, but there's a bigger downward trend in the cold temperature deaths. And it even holds for Africa. Africa sees 10 times as many deaths from cold weather as it sees from hot weather. And we don't talk about that. We just talk about the extreme heat. Again, storms. The number of times I read that we're going to face more storms as a result of climate change, it simply is not true. If you look at the Royal Meteorological Society and the Met Office, they publish an annual State of the Climate report, and it shows a clear downward trend in the occurrence of extreme wind speeds in Britain. We're seeing fewer storms. That's backed up by several studies quoted in the IPCC report. Fewer storms up to about latitude of 60 degrees north, which is the Shetland Islands. Below that, the world is becoming less stormy. We never hear that. Mm. Another study, the data on extreme rainfall is not that good, and on sort of flooding is not that good. But the best we have is a study that is quoted in the IPCC report, which looked at the maximum flood flow in 2,000 rivers throughout the world between 1961 and 2005. And it came to the conclusion that in 7% of rivers, there was increased flood risk. In 11% of rivers, decreased flood risk. And in the rest, there was no real change. Maybe you can find bits of the world which are flooding more as a result of higher temperatures. But, does that sound like a climate cataclysm, Holocaust, or whatever word is, latest in fashion? I mean, it's outrageous the way the genuine science gets twisted by activists and also by many reporters, sadly.
I completely agree. It is outrageous. And I think that point you make about the partial concern they have, where on the one hand, they will go crazy whenever there's hot weather or whenever it can be demonstrated that people suffered as a consequence of a spike in hot weather. They will really dramatize that, propagandize around it, put it onto the front pages, talk about a heat apocalypse, which is what we heard last summer when there was a heat wave in the UK and other parts of Europe. People were using the actual word apocalypse to describe that. But then the well-known, well-established fact that severe cold weather is more dangerous for people, particularly for vulnerable people and elderly people, is rarely talked about in the same way. So we know that every winter in European countries, elderly people in particular die as a consequence of very cold weather. And that doesn't have the same drama surrounding it as episodes of hot weather or sudden storms do in the way in which people talk about them. And I do find this dramatization of weather very interesting. So we had the heat apocalypse, as it was described last summer. There were the floods in Germany a couple of years ago, which were pretty deadly and which were instantly blamed on climate change. And then some experts called that into question. In the week in which you and I are speaking, there are the terrible storms in California, which people are quite swiftly saying is a direct consequence of man-made global warming. Effectively, we brought this on ourselves. And we've seen Ellen DeGeneres saying Mother Nature is unhappy with us. We have to be nicer to Mother Nature. Now, she's just a celebrity in her Montecito mansion. That's how those kinds of people speak. That's how they view the environment and climate change and so on. But actually, that does speak to a pretty common theme in the discussions around climate these days, which is almost that Mother Nature is sending us a sign. Mother Nature is punishing us. Some people even ascribe intention to weather. You know, they talk about it as a real sentient force. We hear about weather of mass destruction and other terms that are used to describe the weather. Isn't there a kind of pre-modern feel to some of this notion that in the past, bad weather might have been seen as a sign of divine displeasure with humankind, and now it's seen as a sign of nature's displeasure with industrious mankind. We've done too much, we've interfered too much. There's a kind of pre-modern, very regressive attitude, isn't there, in the way in which we talk about these kinds of weather events?
Well, it's a sort of medieval morality tale, isn't it? That we're reaping what we sowed and so on. And, you used to look at those celebrities in California whose gardens have been sliding into the sea or something. I mean, just look at that coastline. You can see, why are there cliffs there? Because they've suffered erosion multiple times in the past. Why is that? Why is the land all sort of up and down as it is? Because it suffered multiple landslides in the past. And then, celebrity goes and builds a mansion in that location and is then surprised when erosion continues and landslips continue. And the problem is that we sort of have this, idea of permanence. Obviously we settle land, we buy land, we sell land on this presumption that it's also always going to be there. But you look at the east coast of England, and now any time any bit falls into the sea, of course, it's blamed on climate change. But that erosion's been going on for centuries and centuries. And there's a town called Dunwich. I mean, now a village called Dunwich because the rest of it fell into the sea in about the 16th century or something like that. It goes back that long way. I mean 10,000 years ago, Britain was under ice. About 2/3 of Britain was under ice, and we were connected to the continent by a land bridge. And obviously, as the ice melted, the sea levels rose, and that's all within 10,000 years. 150 human lifetimes. It's not all that long, really. The Earth does change. The climate does change, and in the past, it has changed on a very rapid scale. About 9,600 years ago, something like that, the Earth warmed up by about 7 degrees in a decade and a half. It was some incredibly far more rapid warming than we have now. But the sea level rise is the biggest problem we face in Britain from rising temperatures. As I said, in the last ice age, the sea levels rose as the ice melted and cut us off from the continent and so on. And sea levels rise about 3 millimeters a year. It's inconvenient. Partly because we have a lot of towns on the coast. London is a seaport. But you think, well, if that is the problem, and yes, it is a problem, well, why aren't we doing more to protect our land? And you think, why aren't we building barrages across the Thames estuary and the Severn estuary like the Dutch did in the 1930s to, block off the Zuiderzee and protect Amsterdam and other cities? And, the government and activists are preaching Armageddon, but at the same time, governments are not putting the money and the thought into the very practical measures which can defend us. And the sort of environmentalists, they seem to have this, belief now. Coastal erosion, no, we just got to let it happen. It's nature's desire to make the country smaller. We just got to let it happen. And it's almost rude to try and intervene. Whereas, we can stop that erosion on the East Coast very, very easily, doing what the Dutch do. What they do is they scoop up sand from about 2 miles offshore, they pump it onto the beaches and keep rebuilding the beaches. And, that keeps the beach in good condition, stops the water coming in. If the Dutch took the same attitude towards coastal defence as we do in Britain, they'd have to abandon a quarter of their country, because a quarter of their country is already below sea level. I mean, not because of climate change, but because it always was below sea level, has been reclaimed. And you think, well, if you're going to spout all this Armageddon sort of thing, why aren't you taking the basic defence, taking coastal defence, taking river defence much more seriously than we are?
You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. If you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. With most providers like iTunes or Spotify, it's really easy to do with just one click. And if you get this show via YouTube, then make sure you not only subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel, but that you also click the bell so that you are alerted to every new episode. Yeah, absolutely. And I think often the apocalyptic language or the apocalyptic mindset actually grates against our willingness or even our ability as a society to take those kinds of steps, to take those practical measures that would defend us from some of nature's whims or floodwaters or whatever else it might be, because all our attention is focused on the absolute calamity that is around the corner, the need to just shrink the carbon footprint as much as possible and basically hunker down and hope for the best. So when I'm reading articles about the storms in California, for example, it's usually in paragraph 10 or 11 that you suddenly read something on the weakness of water infrastructures in California and the fact that there hasn't been a great deal of investment in water infrastructure that would protect waterways from bursting their banks or stop them from flooding. But it takes a long time to get to the question of infrastructure because we're talking so much about these storms as payback for mankind's hubris or whatever else it might be. And I do think there is historical ignorance about the fact that, as you say, weather has changed, climate has changed enormously over the centuries and over millennia. So in California, for example, there was a funny article in the Washington Post which said about the drought in California, because before the floods, there was a terrible drought last summer. And this Washington Post piece said, this is the worst drought in California for 1,200 years. And then someone just pointed out, well, what caused the drought 1,200 years ago? That can't have been industrial society. That can't have been modernity. So there's a failure to recognize that severe weather events have happened always. And if anything, we're better protected from them now as a consequence of the modern society that some of these people profess to dislike. I did want to ask you about the global tensions around the climate issue and the net zero issue, which you touch upon in the book, and they kind of came to the fore at the COP meeting in Glasgow, the United Nations climate change discussion they have every now and then. You talk about the fact that in European countries, there seems to be a great willingness to go further and further down the route of green policies, net zero and so on. But obviously China is not buying into it because China is still developing in a particular direction. India is not particularly interested. It's got a lot of poor people to worry about. It wants to grow. It doesn't want to shrink. And America is not particularly interested either, and kind of cold-shouldered some of the proposals that were being made by European countries. What do you think those differences of opinion tell us? Is climate change in some ways just a form of European declinism, where Europe has lost faith in its own capacity to develop and progress and make society better? And through the language of climate change, it can kind of justify that decline in a kind of dramatic fashion.
Well, I think there's a very strong element of that. When Britain passed its net zero commitment in 2019, we were the first major country to do so. And at the time, the idea was that it was going to inspire the rest of the world. We're going to take a lead, and then the rest of the world would join in. And other European countries joined in, and Sweden and Germany have even set themselves tougher targets, as they would do it by 2045, even though Germany's reopening coal mines at the moment. Canada and Chile, one or two other countries, have also said they would put themselves under a supposed legal commitment to get to net zero. But the big emitters haven't. The countries which have made legal commitments account for about 10% of current global emissions. China has set itself an aspiration to achieve net zero by 2060, but it has said quite categorically that it is not going to put economic growth at risk. It's investing in green energy. It's the world's biggest investor in green energy, but it's also the world's biggest investor in coal power. It wants energy. China is a growing economy. It wants energy. As for the US, the whole world is supposed to look up to the US. Donald Trump was sort of roundly attacked for withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Joe Biden was supposed to be the great sort of, fresh air who's going to resume US leadership on this issue. What has he done? He's produced something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't even mention climate change in its name. And what it is, it's basically a piece of protectionism. It said, we'll give handouts to buyers of American cars, electric cars. We'll give handouts to invest in wind and solar power on one condition: all the stuff's made in America. That's what America wants out of it, is a protectionism. But, without the US and the China committing themselves to net zero, there would be no point to it. But China now accounts for, nearly a third of the world's carbon emissions. Partly emitted, in making manufactured goods for the benefit of us. And America, between them, they're nearly 40% of global emissions. And you think, well, there is no point in one country, Britain, destroying its industry, impoverishing its people for the sake of cutting 1% global carbon emissions. There just is no point in that. And, I say, and we're not even cutting them if we're just simply offshoring our emissions. So, I don't disagree with the general direction of policy. We want to go towards cleaner energy, we want to cut our carbon emissions and so on. And, we might get there if all these technologies are required to get there to become invented. But what we really should not do is put a gun against our head and say we've got to do it by 2050, because if we do, we're going to get all kinds of sort of perverse results, export our industry, impoverish our people, and all pretty well for nothing.
I've just got a couple more questions for you, Ross. The first is on, and I've thought about this a lot and I can't quite work out what I think on it, but the first is about green hypocrisy. And this is something I've written about quite a lot, and other people have too. The fact that we're ruled over by eco-feudalists in some ways who constantly lecture us about our carbon footprint while living very fine lives themselves. You mentioned John Kerry. jets around the world on a private jet, justifies it by saying that his mission is so important, so earth-saving, that it's justifiable for him to emit more carbons than us mere mortals. You got Harry and Meghan, of course, who used the pulpit of Vogue magazine to lecture us plebs while taking private jets far more than any of us ever do. And you talked in your book, there's a very funny part in your book where you talk about Joe Biden going to COP in Glasgow, and you talk about him turning up in a 21-car cavalcade, and then he proceeded to sleep at the conference, and you described it as surely the most carbon-intensive nap in history. All of this stuff does raise the question, and this is the question you touch upon briefly at the start of your book. Do they really believe what they're saying about the world coming to an end, or don't they? Or is the hypocrisy simply that they genuinely believe that their mission to re-educate us on matters to do with climate gives them permission to behave in a special way because they are so important to the future of humanity and the future of the planet? So how do you explain that? The fact that we live under a very hypocritical elite, is it that they don't really believe the apocalyptic nonsense, or is it that they just think they're a lot more important than us when it comes to saving the planet?
I can't believe that they really think that the Earth is facing apocalypse. And I mean, you look at some of these, Barack Obama, he just bought himself a sort of waterfront mansion in the States.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time, he's sort of trying to preach that, that we're all going to be drowned by climate change. And it is astonishing. It's sort of do what I say, not do what I do. And I think the other aspect of this, which I find sort of really pretty disgusting, is the way the whole business of carbon offsets and how wealthy people, will try and sort of almost buy their way out of their environmental sins by buying a few carbon offsets. And you think, what's going on here? Rich Western businessman gets to fly, politician gets to fly in their private jet, carry on as they were, and then pays a bit of money. And what does that money go towards? It goes towards things like, there's a group which wants to buy up coal-fired power stations in developing countries and close them down, and basically depriving developing countries of a cheap form of power. But it's dressed up as if it were, some great, philanthropic gesture towards spending money in those countries. And, you've got people just want to carry on as they were. Why they preach to the rest of us. But the really disgusting thing is the way they're prepared to try and impoverish the world's poor, prevent the world's poor developing. And, we were talking about sort of natural disasters earlier, some of which may or may not be caused or made worse by climate change. Well, if you want to cope with natural disaster, it pays to be a wealthy country. And I've often brought up comparison of the Netherlands and Bangladesh. Both are in very vulnerable coastal locations. They both sit on deltas and with a lot of reclaimed land, shifting land and so on, great erosion from rivers and so on. Nobody in the Netherlands dies of flood. Well, did in 1953, but, annually now, Netherlands is a safe country. It copes with flood. Bangladesh, not so much. It still has really serious problems with flooding. What is the difference? The Netherlands is wealthy. Bangladesh is poor. The Netherlands can afford to build seawalls, can afford to shift its towns around, redesign its landscape to cope with the water. Bangladesh can't, or it's just, starting to get into a position where it might, where it is starting to think about those sort of issues. If you want to improve living conditions for people in Bangladesh, what do you think is going to be the most effective way of doing it? by trying to impoverish them, cut their carbon emissions, so maybe the sea might not rise quite as much as we think it will, or by allowing them to develop, allowing them to become rich so they can then have the same sort of infrastructure as the Netherlands. And I mean, to me, there's no contest. If you want to protect yourself against flooding or any other kind of meteorological extreme, you've got to become a wealthy country. That is what, sadly, we may end up depriving the, developing countries the right to become.
That's a very good point, and it brings me on actually to the final question I wanted to ask you. I really agree with your point about carbon offsetting, and it gave rise to some pretty grotesque situations over the past couple of decades. I wrote a piece a few years ago about a carbon offsetting company where you had these wealthy British people who were making donations to this company whenever they took a flight or whenever they drove too much, whenever they felt a pang of guilt about their carbon emitting behavior, they'd make a donation to this charity. As rich people would do with the Catholic Church in the past, they would pay money to absolve themselves of some of their sins. And it turned out that one of the ruses of this carbon offsetting company was to give treadle pumps to farming families in India so that they wouldn't be tempted to use diesel-powered machinery on their farms. So you had this utterly bizarre and perverse situation where wealthy Westerners could carry on with their very nice lives because they had contributed to a situation where very poor farmers in India would do back-breaking work on treadle pumps to raise water on their farms rather than using machinery. So it really was almost like a form of eco-slavery where people over there remain poor so that we can be a little bit more virtuous about our behavior and our carbon emissions. And you make a very good point there about the best way for a nation to protect itself against nature, as we know, as can be demonstrated from modern history, is by becoming a wealthy country. And I wanted to ask you how you think we can turn that aspect of the discussion around a little bit. It's always struck me as very odd that radicals in the West, just 30 or 40 years ago, their argument in relation to the third world would have been, what can we do to help those people achieve our standards of living? And now their argument is, what can we do to protect me as an individual from the destruction that will ensue if all these countries over there do the same stupid stuff that we've done and become industrialized? So you've gone from a worldview that was about assisting the poorest of the world to one that is incredibly narcissistic and self-obsessed and is about protecting us from the pollution that might accrue if other countries follow our industrial path. How can we turn that around? How can we remake the argument for greater forms of global equality, which will give people nicer lives and also allow themselves to protect themselves against nature?
Yeah, it's a sort of, we like to look at them as sort of noble peasants, don't we? They live the lives of environmental purity, which we can't quite manage to live ourselves. But we've got to get back to a position where we were in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, when development was, the outright goal. Huge strides were made in relieving poverty in developing countries and reducing disease, fresh water and so on. And as you say, we've lost that. And there was an advisor to the Indian government who, was complaining on this very point. He said, 20 years ago, development was about making lives better for ourselves. And what's it been reduced to now? It's just this one thing, reducing carbon emissions, this one target, as if that solves problems of lack of education, lack of fresh water, hunger, poverty, and so on. And you think, well, the world has become a far wealthier place over the past 50 years. Some of that, what we generate in the West in the Industrial Revolution, it has spilled down into developing countries. Rates of hunger gone down, disease, and so on. But I just really feel we've lost that now. And we've really got to go back shamelessly to setting rather than carbon targets, setting ourselves targets for fresh water, for education, and particularly women and girls' education, because that's where we know the world is failing at the moment, particularly in Afghanistan and places. For eradication of disease. Development has got to get back to having those aims rather than just reduce it to this sort of one arbitrary target, which it actually is, detracts from some of those other targets. That's the problem.
Ross, thank you very much.
Thank you.